Well, hello, Daniel. It's such a treat to be with you here today to talk about your latest book, Forethought, which is a collection of poems that's being put out by Living Well Publishing and, as I understand, going to be available both in print and ebook from Amazon on March 15th. And I had the good fortune of getting to look at a PDF of the book ahead of time, and I'm about 20 poems in and really completely captivated and really eager to hear you talk more about the genesis of this book and what your experience, both writing it and living it, that led you to write these poems. So maybe you could just start by telling us a little bit about the book.
Thanks, Heather. Looking forward to our chat here and to sending this latest child out into the world. I will read you the short foreword, and that might orient our talking with here this morning. The world stands up. This sentence points to something and is itself an instance of this something. The world stands up in the statement. This is the nature of language, a natural occurrence, rising with the iris in April, the sandhill crane in September. Written and spoken words stand up first in the mind, thought being another natural occurrence. Early hominids devoted enormous amounts of precious energy to evolving a neocortex, home of human thinking. As a result, mentation has become our species' dominant trait. Most of us, most of the time, live first in a mental topography. The poems in this book are instances. Each points to a world standing up before our thinking, before our saying anything about it to ourselves or to anyone else. I hope reading them refreshes your experience of this world, as writing them has refreshed mine.
I love that word, refreshed. That is exactly how I felt reading them. I tend to read poems when I'm either too sleepy to stay awake or too awake to fall asleep. So I'm in that kind of liminal state where my kind of rational need to understand everything mind is a little bit offset. And I found these poems just kind of piercingly open in terms of the way they connected me with the stuff that's already here, but in a fresh way. Maybe you could just tell us a little more kind of about your journey towards writing this book, like, and also just your history with poetry. I know that you've talked about your sister writing poems, and your other books are so poetic. I had guessed that you probably write poems, but I hadn't known you were working on this.
Thanks, Heather. Appreciate those kind words. The first poem I wrote was in college, and I have been writing poetry since. The poems in this book span probably about 20 years of my life, the last 20 years. Some of them have appeared in magazines and journals, but I'd never collected the poems and put them side by side. So what I did was I went through couple of hundred poems that I'd written, and I selected, I think there's about 113 in this volume, that seem to hang together around this theme of our experience of reality before our thinking about reality. So the poems are grouped into little sections. I was bemused to see that some of the sections were Buddhist, some of them were poems about love, Some were poems about bugs, flies, crickets, little critters. And it seemed to me that my connection with the natural world was a regular source of poetry. Waking up in the morning and looking at the stars above Santa Barbara Canyon, or watching the sunset here on the high mesa in Taos, New Mexico. This experience of nature, the natural world, seemed oftentimes to be the genesis for a lot of the poetry that I wrote.
Yeah, that's certainly my experience reading the first chunk of poems. You have a passage on trees, you have a number on birds. And I enjoyed the flow as I read them, how I could see you kind of working a theme as you explored something and then kind of moving on to the next. Would you like to say a little more about the title? You've sort of alluded to, forethought, right? This realm experience before thinking. But I'd love to hear you riff more about that title.
I'll tell you a little story that probably informed that choice. I was training at a Zen center in Germany back in the 80s, and was out with a friend one Sunday afternoon walking in the woods. And Sunday afternoon and evening, ever since my school days, have been associated with a certain cognitive and emotional milieu. So the weekend was ending, it was time to go back to school, have to start doing homework again. There was a bit of heaviness, probably not depression per se, but a feeling of being burdened at the end of one thing and the start of another. So Cecilia and I were out walking in the woods, and we got in her car and drove back to the Zen center where she was one of the teachers, and got out of the car in this state, and I closed the door. And when I heard the door close, everything fell away. And I realized, oh, there's no such thing as Sunday evening and burden and something that comes next. It's all completely empty. So it was one of many moments of insight into the nature of reality before thinking that came about probably largely as a result of my Zen training. I know that there are people who don't have a spiritual practice at all and come into these kinds of experiences of what we could call reality, or the way things are before we start thinking about them, and then having the feelings related to our thoughts. So each of these insights into a prior reality, that which is before thought, has been a little cairn that marks my journey along my way. And a number of the poems reference these little glimpses of the way things really are.
Gosh, I have so many questions from what you just said there. And I would love to get you reading a poem sooner than later. So maybe let me just write down my question. And maybe this is a moment to have you read a poem, and then we can get back to some other conversation about it. Do you have one in mind, or would you like me to choose one?
I can read the first poem in the book, which is directly related to the theme that we're looking at here together. The title of the poem is The Man of Great Peace. The man of great peace has no name. For this, he is known everywhere. He is the intimate, the firstborn, indigene of an indigence, great flower of earth from which the morning star steps forth in person, steps forth in this first person. White gold bangle, eye of an ignorant man, first luminary, unknown to any other as to himself. The man of great peace rests in peace. His corpse is our idea of him.
Being the first poem, this is one I've read several times. I have to say, each time I read it or hearing you read it again, different things jump out at me. It's funny to talk about poems using words to convey that experience, which is maybe actually before the words, but after the words that you've read, which I think speaks to what you were talking about in the introduction about how the sentence stands up and then is itself a part of reality. It's just beautiful, right? This great flower of the earth and this white gold bangle. I just find the imagery really beautiful. And for folks listening, you said "I" of an ignorant man, and "I" is spelled E-Y-E. But as I heard you read it, of course, I heard the letter I, which I love the playfulness of that and how it kind of creates this shimmering feeling inside my head. And then that final line about, his corpse is our idea of him. And I wonder if you would say that, when we put things into thought, that something dies or something is lost or something, we're letting go of something.
Absolutely, Heather. Thank you for your careful reading. Very much enjoy reading your writing. And there's a pleasure in using language intentionally and reading or being read closely. So the backstory for this poem is the story of Buddha's enlightenment, where he was sitting under a Bodhi tree after trying a number of spiritual paths that were a common currency in India during his day, including a path of great asceticism, denying himself food and water and the other things the body needs to be healthy. And none of these paths satisfied him. So he decided to just sit down and perhaps was in that state that you've described, somewhere between sleep and waking. Sat all night, and as day broke, he looked up. And in Chinese accounts of the experience, we'll read that he was confirmed by the morning star. So his sense of being a separate body and mind fell away, and he was the star. And then he exclaimed, "Oh, I see. All beings are already enlightened. It's just that their delusive thoughts and feelings obscure the experience from them." So fundamentally, when Buddha looked up, nothing changed, except that his preoccupations dropped away, and he clearly saw the way things are. The Chinese, who are poetic writers, describe that as being confirmed by the star. So it's a poem about that story, but equally it's a poem about my story. I too have these experiences of the fallen away body and mind, just the morning star, just the parking lot in the Zen center, just this, before any thinking or feeling arises. So it's a story about me, but it's a story about you. It's a story about anyone who comes into this more comprehensive experience of who they really are and of the way things really are.
So a couple things struck me about the story you told about the Buddha, and I guess you're also saying your own story, which is he tried many things that were not quite satisfying to him before he came to this point. And of course, you are a cognitive behavioral therapist, as am I, and I have tried many different kinds of therapy before coming to CBT. So I kind of resonate with the seeker, I guess, right? I'm still looking for something one senses is out there, or experience that is to be had. And you also, I think, are alluding to kind of a core principle of CBT, right? Which is that our thoughts create our feelings, right? That all the suffering happens once we've added thought and language to the game. And in CBT, we often think about either changing our thoughts or changing our relationship to our thoughts. And I'm just wondering if you could maybe comment a little bit on this, how this experience has informed your work as a therapist.
Boy, absolutely. So when we're doing cognitive therapy, we're looking at the quality of our thinking, looking at the structure of our thoughts. Is the thought a good map of reality? Does it match the fact pattern of the way things are? And to the extent that the thought is a good fit, it will likely be a helpful thought, an adaptive thought, we could say, will help us succeed, connect with each other, promote wellness physically and mentally. To the extent that a thought is distorted, it's not a good map of reality. It will drive emotional suffering, anguish perhaps. So this is a tremendously life-giving science of the mind. And it goes back before Buddha's time to the Upanishad literature, the Vedic literature in India, that noticed exactly what you just said, that it's our thinking and our behavior that creates our experience of life and gives it the emotional meaning that it has. So the poems in this book are pointing to what comes before all of that. They're not concerned with the quality of the thinking. They want to convey, I think oftentimes they fall short, perhaps all of the time they fall short, but they want to point to the experience that's prior to thinking at all. And one could say they're poems about the interface between reality and what Wallace Stevens referred to as the imagination. He wrote a wonderful essay, The Necessary Angel, which was about this relationship between reality and our imaginal capacity, our ability to think, to feel, to remember, to dream, to plan. And much of Stevens' poetry, which I really respond to, is one of my very favorite American poets, is precisely about those interstices, those in-between spaces where there's reality and then whatever imaginally is happening for us. And he himself has written many, many wonderful poems about that in-between place.
From what you said, it sounds like maybe your Zen training is facilitated, maybe you're more reliable access to that space. I'd just love to hear you talk more about your experience in that, because I would say personally for me, I spend a lot of time in my head, in my thoughts, in my feelings, living it there. And it's a bit of a grind trying to meditate enough or do things enough to kind of read enough poetry, right, to or remember my dreams to get back into that space. And I'd just love to hear more about your path along that and what role that plays in your life.
I was raised Catholic. I went to Catholic school through college, and this was the pre-Vatican Church. My brother, who like me was an altar boy, learned Latin to serve at Mass. I was right there at the cusp where I didn't have to learn the Latin because the Mass started to be said in English when I was in first or second grade, something like that. So a context for my development was Catholicism. And interestingly, 3 of my 5 Zen teachers have been Catholic religious, priests, monks, and nuns, who, to deepen their own experience of their spiritual path, looked east. My teachers, Willigus Jaeger and Joan Rick, went to Japan to study Zen and then returned to the West to teach in Europe and the United States. So there's this tradition within Catholicism, the contemplative tradition it's called, oftentimes associated with monasteries. Saint Teresa, Saint John of the Cross, Meister Eckhart were exemplars of this tradition and wrote very eloquently, oftentimes in poetry, about their mystical experience. So when I was a little guy coming up, I just knew, because I lived in this culture, that reality was part of the story, my perception of reality, but there was something else. And I assumed that it was possible to contact that thing before appearances, we could say. The world appears a certain way, but the appearance is not the whole story. And I used to go into church after school, and they didn't lock churches back then. So I would just go and I would sit, which is what I do every morning of my life these days, just sit. And I remember once a priest came out to work on the altar, and he saw me there and he looked very concerned and walked down the aisle, and he knew my name because it's a small Irish Catholic parish. He said, "Danny boy, what's the matter?" As soon as I heard the question, I realized this person will not help me. This person doesn't get it. So I said, "Oh, Father, nothing's the matter. I'm just making a visit." That was the language of the day, making a visit. And he said, "Well, why don't you just run along and play now?" So I learned a lot in that exchange. And when I met my first spiritual director, who was the abbot of a Trappist monastery in Oregon, who was training with Zen teachers around the world and had a little group of monks that he'd do Zazen with there in the morning. There was, for me, the first time someone standing within my tradition who understood what it was that I wanted, what I was trying to do. And within a few years, I'd connected with Willigus Jaeger, who was the first Catholic priest to be formally recognized as a Zen master. And that's the center that I went to and trained for a year in Würzburg, Germany.
I have more questions for you, but maybe this isn't a good time to read another poem, just so we can get more taste of that. Is there one that you want to pick? Do you want me to pick one? What should we?
How about a poem about a bug?
Great.
My grandsons, to whom the book is dedicated, are big fans of bugs. So trying to walk to school, which is only a 10-minute walk for an adult, is about a 30-minute walk with Ollie and Brody, because there's so many interesting bugs along the way to stop and talk to and mess around with and stuff. So the poem is called Sentinel, and it has an epigraph by a Japanese poet, I believe of the Tang Dynasty, Issa. And this is the epigraph. Oh, do not harm this fly. He wrings his hands. He wrings his feet. It's taken me this long to be kind to a fly. One arrived today on her last legs, at the end of a year not marked by kindness, clinging to me as to some last hope, until I lifted her by one sepia wing and placed her feet first on the windowsill in the weakening sun of the late afternoon, keeping watch through her many eyes.
Mm. When did you write that poem?
I wrote it here in New Mexico, so it would have been sometime in the last, 15 years.
Hmm.
But when exactly, I don't remember.
I don't have that one in front of me, so I have the words just lingering in my memory, but you said at the end of a year not marked by.
Yeah, I'll read it again if you'd like.
Yeah, please do.
The poem is Sentinel, and the epigraph from Isa is, oh, do not harm this fly. He wrings his hands. He wrings his feet. It's taken me this long to be kind to a fly. One arrived today on her last legs, at the end of a year not marked by kindness, clinging to me as to some last hope, until I lifted her by one sepia wing and placed her feet first on the windowsill in the weakening sun of the late afternoon, keeping watch through her many eyes.
There's a tenderness in that that's really touching. I find myself curious about, Daniel Minty, the 5-year-old boy who was compelled to sit in church, and the Daniel Minty who lived through a year not marked by kindness, and who might say who I experience as someone who's extraordinarily kind. And I don't know if there's anything more you want to say about your personal history in relation to this poem or this path that you found yourself on.
The experience of reality before our thinking about reality is an experience that I think is best described by the word love. When we leave behind our notions of things, including the first notion, that of a separate self, what we are plunged into, or what plunges and becomes us, is love. This is my own experience, and it's the experience of writers, poets, mystics, across all of the great world traditions and across all of time. So loving kindness or compassion is something that we can express with kind words and kind behavior. And I think when we're expressing loving kindness, we're expressing reality. We also express hatred and greed, but we're not expressing final reality. We're expressing these disturbances that obscure final reality if we're speaking or acting in greedy or hateful ways. So loving kindness, compassion for all beings is what's happening, really. And I realize that's a potentially provocative thing to say, as what could be a world war has broken out in Europe. And we get daily reports of the polar opposite of loving kindness. But my perception is no act, no thought is separate from reality. So even these very distorted, deadly, grievous thoughts and acts are no other than reality itself.
So, right. I know that in sort of traditional Buddhist loving kindness practice, we pass through loving kindness for difficult people, for enemies, and then to all beings, which I suppose would fit in with the stance that you're taking towards all that is happening.
My teacher, Williges Jaeger, wrote about God's shadow, and that was his language. That traditional Catholic theology would set up two kingdoms or forces that were separate from each other, the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of hell. But all of the Catholic mystics, I'm thinking principally of Meister Eckhart, said, no, there's only one kingdom. And to try and point to that in the face of great suffering, injustice, greed, hatred, and ignorance, Williges wrote of God's shadow side, that ultimate reality, just like individual human beings, have this dark side. And that's satisfying for me. That formulation works. I've never seen an impulse outside of myself that I haven't also noticed come up within myself, be it to treat a bug with kindness, or be it to hurt another being. So all of that is the divine life, and our opportunities / challenge as participants in the divine life is to set an intention. Which side do we want to come down on? The cognitive science has revealed that the brain's reward system will reward hostility. So a vertebrate that beats up another vertebrate gets a cascade of reward chemicals. Nature selects for that because it's more likely that the biggest, baddest, being on the block will pass his genes on to the next generation. Similarly, acts of loving kindness will trigger a cascade of reward chemicals, because that too raises the probability that we'll have more relation and that our genes will get passed along. So nature itself is supremely indifferent. In the Christian tradition, this would be called free will. We can choose. How do we want to get our dopamine? By being greedy and hateful, hurting other beings, or by being loving and kind? It's up to us.
Yeah, sorry, I'm noticing just a lot of sadness coming up as you talk about this. It's not unwelcome. Is there another poem you'd like to read?
Well, I realized as we were talking in this direction, I've written a number of poems about this dynamic of living in accord with reality or living in opposition to reality. And I'll read a poem called Environmental. Environs, that which surrounds, but what? If you, then me. If us, them. If earth, it's sky. If sky, it's stars. Each star, its whole night. Nothing ever surrounds the night, moving round and round, black of ease, self-same, elan, vital as an animal, as blood engorging the heart, fast core, purlieu, that is, the nothing left over, the nothing left out. Where does wreck of the environment begin? The.
Thank you for reading that poem. I printed some pages out backwards and I was like, I must be missing a page, and then I was like, no, I don't think I am. Yes. I'm suspecting something might happen if you read that poem backwards, but okay, right. And there's another poem right after that called Environment. So yeah, that's very beautiful. I'm seeing the line that stood out to me. Nothing ever surrounds the night, moving round and round. Yeah, I guess I'm thinking of the mindfulness expression, the whole catastrophe. It's all part of it.
There was an interesting echo of this poem. I think it was in the Post this week. Someone wrote an editorial and the title was, "It's not the Ukraine." And I thought, oh, they see it too. We're talking about the environment. We objectify ourselves in that expression, distance ourselves, separate ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Would be like my saying, the Heather.
Mm-hmm.
I talked to the Heather. No, I talked to Heather.
Mm.
But we don't notice most of the time how language creates and maintains our distance from the way things really are. And the last line of the poem suggests one way in which we do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. That's funny. I was just chatting with my father this morning, who corrected me about the way to refer to Ukraine. So lovely serendipity here. Right. It makes it so much less personal, right? We don't put the in front of the name of someone that certainly not someone that we care about.
I think it happens when we say those people.
Mm-hmm.
It's another way to straight arm ourselves in that expression and objectify what isn't an object, which is not separate from our very selves. So what I hope the poetry does in this volume, and certainly throughout space-time, is calls our attention to our use of language and the ways in which it can connect us, and it can separate us, and it can kill us. There's a line from Wallace Stevens where the mind is portrayed as a lion sleeping on its paws. And the last line is, it can kill a man. And that's where all the killing starts, is with a thought. And a thought that's a distorted thought, because it doesn't recognize our essential unity with each other. The fact that there is not an other, they're simply expressions of who we really are, from flies to Ukrainians to Russians to even Californians.
Well, thank you, Daniel, for this wonderful book of poems, which I am eager to hold in my physical hands, the physical copy of, and for this conversation, and for your sharing your experience of being part of this reality.
You're very welcome. Thank you for your interest in my work and our time together here this morning. You're one of my exemplars when it comes to precise thinking about things. And when we teach together, looking forward to doing that in Warsaw, Poland, if the war has not consumed that country as well this summer, I learn something essential about the way things really are. So I'm grateful to you for your excellent heart, mind, and the fact that we're fellow travelers along this great way.
Thank you very much. Likewise.